we reconvene for a little bit. I'm going to start with a little bit of big picture stuff, and then we'll get to we'll get to sort of some of the more detailed presentations. The way that we sort of thought about the panels today is that we would start with sort of the larger or some larger themes, which we discussed in the first panel. And in this panel, we wanted to talk about, one thing that runs throughout the entire book is a survey that Sanjay mentioned quite briefly. We'll spend a little more detail. We'll spend some more time talking about what was done and why it was done. But also to get into some of the details. So my co-panelists today, actually the four of us wrote contiguous chapters within this book. So there is a certain logical flow to what we have done. And what I want to do before we get into some of the technical details is to sort of tell you a little bit about how we got around to operationalizing the idea of the national capital region. So this is all work that actually started 9 years ago at the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, CASI. At that time, CASI was headed by Devesh Kapoor, who was instrumental in this project, and Milan Vaishnav, who's at Carnegie Endowment. Since then, Devesh has moved on. Tariq Tachil is the head of CASI now, and urban work continues, right? So this is all sort of feeding into a larger amount of work on urban India that is taking place there. Simultaneously, CPR has also been doing a series of projects, not just on Delhi, but on urban India. So there was a very natural synergy between these two institutions. So this work initially started, as I said, in 2013. And we had one before lots of trials and tribulations, which we don't need to get into. We honed in on studying the National Capital Region, NCR. Now, NCR is a bit of a beast, right? It's 22 districts outside of Delhi. It's 4 states and union territories. If we just take 2011 census, its urban population is approximately 30 million. Its total population is approximately 50 million. Huge land area, population growth around 20% per decade. Now, all of that's great, except the problem was when we started the program, started this project, nobody had any idea what NCR looked like. It existed on websites, it existed in committee meetings. The way that it works is that certain districts are notified to be within NCR, but any urban imagination of what that might be, where the borders might be, how these pieces fit with each other, do they fit with each other, do we care if they fit with each other? None of that really existed in any kind of urban imagination, certainly not neither qualitative nor quantitative imagination. So part of what we ended up doing with this project was, of course, to run a survey, but also to bring together a very diverse set of scholars. You saw in the first panel. Even in this panel, we have 2 political scientists and 2 geographers who cut across qualitative and quantitative methods. We also have sociologists, historians, policy practitioners, scholars of the environment, right? They're sort of all in this book. And part of it is to grapple with this mess. Now, the intellectual challenge that we had is, can we think about not just a study of Delhi, not just a few settlements in Delhi and how they connect, but can you actually imagine this at metropolitan scale, right? Can you imagine the national capital region as some metropolitan unit over which we can do analysis? And how do you construct that analysis? Just to give one, sort of interesting problem that we face over and over again, and Kushi here will talk about it much more. In a very real way, we've talked about migration into Delhi, which is you happen to Delhi. But Delhi is also changing very quickly. New districts are being notified all the time. The borders of it are growing. So there are many, many people, even in our sample, who were not born in anything that resembled the National Capital Region or Delhi, but today they are in it. So they're not migrants. They didn't happen to Delhi, Delhi happened to them, right? So this is what you grapple with when you're dealing with National Capital Region and thinking about NCR at metropolitan scale. This is why we call the book Colossus. So when we thought about operationalize this in a quantitative sense. We knew very early on that we need what we call spatial representativeness. Now, spatial representativeness, the way to think about this is that I can draw any shape on the map, and broadly the sample that I'm drawing from that shape, within that shape, should look like the population that's there. And the reason why you need that is because we don't trust administrative boundaries in India. We don't know what the shape of NCR actually is, right? So we are actually drawing shapes on a map and trying to make claims about it. So you need to have this notion of spatial representativeness, right? And so we realized fairly early on that the way to do this was not to use existing census enumeration block, this, that, which can be very difficult, but to use polling booths, because the election commission is putting polling booth areas where the density of voters is higher. So insofar as one can think about where voters are and where the population is, you're able to sample from something that tracks the spatial density of the urban region. Now we know that not everybody's on the voter list. So what we did was we took 80% of the sample off of the voter list and 20% as a random walk in those areas for people who may not be on the voter list. As I'll show you, it turns out the voter list is actually a good way to go if you make a certain kind of correction. The other issue that we faced is that, and something that we wanted to be very clear about here, so often people, you will see in major surveys that you're running, they put weights, right? So first, they don't tell you whether the weights are sampling weights, which is that population was sampled with a different probability, or their post-stratification weight, which means that we have a population that oversampled somebody, undersampled somebody, and we're weighting it ex post. Rarely hear that information. That's called the post-stratification weight. We realized that so little is known about this population that if we started weighting certain observations versus others, you're going to start making all kinds of biased claims. So all of the work that we did here, we put a lot of effort into demonstrating that without weighting our data, you're going to get something that looks like the population you might expect. And that's what allows us to do many of the analyses that we've done. Now, the underlying survey, as Sanjay mentioned in the previous panel, many things we were not able to cover, but we have detailed roster on education, employment, migrant status, consumption patterns, infrastructure, intermediaries, lots of social outcomes, network behavior, which shopkeepers you go to, marriage, who you eat with, who you interact with, right? A lot of this is a large social survey. Only a part of it is actually what ends up in the book. Okay, so what does a sample look like? So this is just taken from the book, which is why it's in black and white. What I want you to notice is that, of course, there's this big central cluster, right, which is Delhi and the suburbs that we think of, Gurgaon, Faridabad, Ghaziabad, Noida. But then there are these funny other patches, right? This is really what urban NCR looks like, right? Which is that there's a large central part of the city. But then there are these other patches that show up because the expanse is so great. If you, for instance, were to drive to Meerut, which is also an NCR, between you're going to see a lot of farmland, right? So the urban cluster sort of ends up after you go for a couple of hours. And so this is actually what the spatial topography of urban NCR looks like. You can see I've actually narrowed the window. There are things in NCR that are not in the map, like Bharatpur and stuff like that. But Panipat is the extent of what I've shown here. Okay. You can see that at least by basic sort of metrics of representativeness in Delhi, we have numbers that are fairly comparable. Looking at our data and sort of what we have from the data sets. We're going to talk a little bit more about the migrant issue in Khusdeep's presentation, which is coming up in a little bit. Just as I said, I promised you a little bit of information about voter list and random walk. And I'll do 1 or 2 minutes on substantive things, and I'll hand it over to the speakers. So as I mentioned, we sampled voter list and we did a random walk. And what you see, what the x-axis is, the number of people who are eligible to vote, so 18 plus, but who are not voting, right? Who are not on the voter list. And then we have sort of broken it down by proportions. Now, what you can see is that the proportion of households that have everybody who should be on the voter list is actually remarkably similar, whether or not we look at the voter list sample or the random walk sample. It's only as we start looking at having more than zero non-voting eligible members that you see that the random walk sample has a slightly higher number of them, which is to say that there are more eligible non-voting members in random walk households than in voter list households. Now, this actually is a political economy thing. So often in order to get benefits, you want somebody in the household to show up on the voter list. But not everyone might show up on the voter list, right? So somebody who's married into the household or others who've moved recently. So this is kind of a phenomenon that you see. If you want to reach households, often the voter list is fine. If you want to tabulate the population, you need to take account of non-voting members who might be of voting age within the household. That's sort of an interesting thing that came out of doing this work. Okay, so a couple of quick substantive points. I think Sanjoy talked about it, in abstract terms. We also put some data to it. As I said, we were aiming for spatial representativeness. The upper left graph is just sort of looking at the core of the city, so not looking at the satellite areas, and the density of the overall population. This panel on the upper right is the scheduled caste population, and on the bottom is the Muslim population. What you can see is that the scheduled caste population is a little more concentrated, particularly in the northeast and southeast portions of NCR. The Muslim population is far more concentrated. And to just give you a sense, if you were to just put some numbers to it, the scheduled caste population is about 17% of the population. If it were randomly distributed across the space, you would imagine that within 1 kilometer, you would have approximately 17% of the population being scheduled caste. It's about 30% of the population, right? So if I draw a 1 kilometer buffer around scheduled caste populations, about 1/3 of the time they're living near a scheduled caste person. For the Muslim population, which is 11% of our samples, it's a smaller proportion. If I draw a 1 kilometer buffer, 40% of the population is Muslim. So the Muslim population is far more concentrated in empirical terms. Now, if we just look beyond space, it gets even more extreme. So we asked people if they interact with their neighbor, and if so, can you tell us about caste, religion? Conditional on interacting with their neighbor, a scheduled caste person is interacting with another scheduled caste household 44% of the time. For a Muslim household, if they're interacting with their neighbor, conditional interacting with their neighbor, that neighbor is Muslim 80% of the time, right? So it tells you something that shows up all throughout the book, that even when we are talking about spatially mixed areas, without sort of accounting for levels of social interaction and methods of social interaction, you can be misled, right? So segregation is more than just spatial segregation. A couple of final points, and then I'll hand it over to the rest of the speakers. We constructed an asset index. I won't go into the details of it, but what I can tell you is that broadly, the average of the asset index is 0. It looks like a normal curve, right? So max is approximately 2, minimum is approximately -2. Most of the population is around the center. And if I just look in percentile terms, our Sikh population is quite a bit wealthier in the region. The median Sikh person is at the 80th percentile of wealth, and the median Muslim is at the 40th percentile of wealth. Hindus, because they're such a large proportion of the population, are right at the median. You can also see that in caste. The median general caste person is at about the 64th percentile of wealth. The median scheduled caste person is similar to Muslims at the 39th percentile of wealth. But one of the things that we realize is that despite this extreme sort of economic inequality, you find very rich people living next to very poor people. This is not surprising for those of us who walk around Delhi. The argument that I have actually made in a chapter that I've written is that it is about the role of informal bonds between labor, basically those who employ and those who are employed. So in a world in which you don't have formal contracting, you don't have any recourse if something were to go wrong, you tend to use spatial distance as a substitute for what might be another legal mechanism to sanction somebody. In other words, if somebody comes into my house, housekeeping, fixes something, does something I'm unhappy with, if I live close to that person, I can get to that person. If I don't know where that person came from, then I can't, right? And just leave with a little bit of an anecdote. We now see with digitalization, things like urban clap, with Uber, this phenomenon changing. So it used to be that you had to use your local taxi stand to stay safe to get home at night. Perhaps you still might, but increasingly people are using things like Uber or Ola, where there's a formal mechanism, right? So even if the person might live far from you, something goes wrong, you can dial up the company and sanction the driver, right? So this is sort of how the interplay of space and class and economic complementarity is played, right? Which is why you see rich and poor living next to each other, but maybe you will see Hindus and Muslims living far apart from each other because of Hindu-Muslim tensions. So a couple of concluding thoughts. Some of the abstract things we get from the data, temporality as an actor, right? So when you are moving to the city has certain implications for the kind of life you lead. The state as an actor, which the rest of the speakers will talk about, I have not spoken about. Everything I've talked about has not mentioned anybody's government, but the state and the governance structure in which you live has a huge impact on the quality of life that you lead. And of course, spatial dimensions of social change, right? Who you live with, how close you live with another population, and what that might say about your future. So these are all sort of things that we're going to talk about. With that introduction done, I am going to hand it over to Shahana Sheikh. Shahana is a PhD candidate at Yale. She's a political scientist. And she's going to talk through a chapter that she has co-edited with a number of others and sort of offer some insights, bringing the state back in, if you will.
Thanks, Neelanjan. We've had several points today. We've spoken about inequality within the NCR or specifically in the NCT. And here we have, as of now, not really spoken too much about the state, as Neelanjan pointed out. And so, what is the state for people living in the NCR? It's a bit hard to define given the geographic spread of the region. It spans Delhi, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, and Haryana. But at least for the NCT, that is the National Capital Territory of Delhi, which, as we saw in Neelanjan's presentation, is sort of at the center.
Seems to be not for whatever reason. Last time as well. It's seeing everything else, right? We're learning about Zoom as we do this. Sorry. So I think every time we have to close out and close back in. Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, so what is the state, or at least sort of the leadership of the state in the NCT or the National Capital Territory of Delhi? What we know, several of us know, that Delhi is characterized by sort of an intersection of three levels of government: the local, the state, as well as the union of the central level of government, and this often results in a sort of fragmented governance across the city. As again, we are aware, several of us are aware, the two key functions in governance which remain with the Union Government of India. In today's context, specifically the land use planning function remains with the Government of India, and this is performed by the Delhi Development Authority, or the DDA, which is an agency of the Ministry of Urban Development. And policing, or the function of law and order, remains also with the Union Government of India and is performed, as we know, by the Delhi Police, which is an agency of the Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, with the exception of the areas of the New Delhi Municipal Council and the Delhi Cantonment Board, which roughly account for about 5 to 6% of the NCT, for most of Delhi, basic services provision is done or undertaken by agencies of the state government, that is the government of NCT of Delhi. So whether it's water, whether it's electricity, whether it's sanitation, these are all for these services. We have agencies that are responsible at the state level. And then finally, for solid waste management, that is the collection, disposal of solid waste, it's at the local level. The municipal corporations of Delhi now consolidated back into one corporation that are responsible. Various policy documents of these state and the state and the government agencies here that we spoke about tend to consider the residents of Delhi through a typology of settlements or a typology of housing settlements. These are 8 categories of settlements that range from the most legal planned settlements where land tenure is very, very secure, and these are the planned colonies of Delhi. And on the other end of the spectrum are the least legal or the most illegal, unplanned types of settlement, which are characterized by highly insecure land tenure. And these are in the form of the Jhuggi Jhopri clusters in Delhi. At the turn of the century, the government's own estimates put the percentage of Delhi's residents or Delhi's population that was living in planned colonies at less than a quarter of the population. What's also interesting to note is that the estimates of the population shares that you see in this table are reproduced in several policy documents even today. That is to say that the government and the state, broadly speaking, continues to acknowledge that less than a quarter of Delhi is in planned settlements, that is the planned colonies. The Cities of Delhi project, which is housed here at CPR, which several of us were a part of, focused on studying 3 categories of these housing settlements. So we focus on the last 3 categories that you see in this table. That is the Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, the unauthorized colonies, and the resettlement colonies. We consider these 3 types of settlements to be excluded settlements. And as we go along, perhaps it will become clear as to why we call them excluded settlements. But what is important to note here is that Jhuggi Jhopri clusters and unauthorized colonies are illegal and unplanned settlements. And while resettlement colonies are legal and planned, there are several elements of informality in service provision in these colonies. And so we included them as part of our study. Through our work in the Cities of Delhi project, we essentially argue that the place or the settlement type where a Delhi resident lives determines the level of basic service delivery that they can access. And this leads to a differentiated citizenship that we observe across Delhi. We draw on evidence which comes from extensive field work that was conducted back in 2012 to 2015 in about 3 years across 10 excluded settlements of Delhi. These included Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, unauthorized colonies, as well as resettlement colonies. And we also conducted an in-depth review of legal and institutional frameworks, as well as policy documents to support our claims. Now, to briefly highlight some of the key findings of the Cities of Delhi project. First, looking at the Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, or often known as JJCs, these are characterized by insecure tenure with the possibility of demolition or eviction by the landowning agency, which most often is a public agency. That is to say that most of the land on which JJ clusters in Delhi are situated is land which is owned by a government agency. Service access in JJCs is not so much limited by the legislation, but it is limited a lot by practice. That is to say, the sort of mechanisms in the field in particular settlements tend to limit the kind of access to basic services that residents of Jhuggi-Jhopri clusters have. Unauthorized colonies, on the other hand, are built in contravention of zoning regulations, and they sit on land that is meant for non-residential purposes, so land which is meant for purposes other than residential use. These settlements tend to have or have had very little history of demolition and eviction, and this is sort of revealed through the kinds of investments several of these residents make in their housing structures in these unauthorized colonies. Much of the built-up form in these unauthorized colonies will be, 3 to 4 floors above ground. And this is all self-investment by these residents. The government process of regularization has brought improvements in infrastructure and services, but this only happens gradually. And what is worth noting here is that the existing regulations and legislation that exists actually allows for service provision, before the process of regularization is completed. So often we hear that only until we have to wait for the process of regularization for service provision to happen, but actually the legislation does not need that process to be completed for services to be extended to unauthorized colonies. In establishing resettlement colonies, which is the third category of excluded settlements that we studied, land was provided to eligible slum residents, or specifically residents of Jhuggi-Jhopri clusters. And usually this land was provided to them at locations far away from where they were living earlier. That is the location of the JJC. In the recent waves of resettlement, most of these resettlement colonies are located in the periphery of Delhi. Over the years, the sizes of the resettlement plots also reduced. In the 2000s, the resettlement wave that was carried out only gave out plots which were sized at 12 square meters. And of course, now, most recently, this policy has changed to one of giving resettlement flats. Although tenure is granted in resettlement colonies to those who are resettled there, it is more secure than the other categories of excluded settlements. The conditions of tenure are still pretty restrictive, giving only the right to reside and not the right to rent or the right to sell or the right to transfer to those who are resettled in the resettlement colonies. More importantly, services, including the required bulk infrastructure, which enables delivery of basic services such as water and sewerage infrastructure, has followed residents at these sites until many years after they have been resettled. That is to say, a resettlement may have taken place in a particular year, but service provisioning has happened over many years after that resettlement. And this time lag has actually led to many informal arrangements for service provision in these colonies. Although access to electricity is widely available across these excluded settlements that we studied, and there's very little variation in that, what we find is that there is limited reliable provision of water and sanitation. And this, we are talking about public provisioning, which is that which is provided by government. There is also inequitable distribution, and specifically, this is the case for water supply. Most residents, as a result, have to rely on this kind of a complex mix of political patronage, political intermediation, and pragmatism of government departments, and to some extent, community and private solutions, which come at a premium, just so that they can access basic water and sanitation services. So how does some of these findings relate to the survey data, which was collected as part of the CASI NCR survey? A postcoding of the survey data that Shamindra carried out, and he'll talk about the procedure shortly, basically mapped the polling booths, which were a part of the NCT, to the settlement types. And so this essentially allows us to sort of, in a sort of post coding sense, understand the economic condition of the surveyed households across these settlements. So looking at the asset index, which Neelanjan talked about, what we see is, if you look at the first figure, what we see is that so what we've done here is plotted the share of households that are from different deciles of the asset index across different settlement types. Now, if it was the case that various households in a particular settlement type had the exact same distribution on asset index as the NCT, then we would basically see a kind of uniform distribution with 10% of households in every decile for a particular settlement. Now, of course, that is not what we see. What we see is that for planned colonies, only about 2.4% of the planned colony households that were surveyed, they come from the second lowest decile of the asset index, whereas 22.3% of the households come from the topmost decile of the index. And for the households that are from the Jhuggi-Jhopri clusters, the distribution is almost exactly the opposite, where 25.3% of the JGC households that were surveyed are coming from the lowest decile of the asset index, whereas only 0.6% of them are coming from the highest top, the top 10% of the highest decile. Interestingly, the distribution of households that come from unauthorized colonies is actually relatively reflective of the distribution of households across the NCT. Specifically on water, which we found to be a service to which access was quite poor across the excluded settlements. While the survey did not ask respondents about the source of water supply, what it did ask households was whether they used a water treatment device. So if we look at the second figure here, what we see here is that households that are coming from JJCs, that are the Jhuggi-Jhopri cluster settlements, about 30% of those households reported that they had a water treatment device. About the similar modal value for unauthorized colony households was at about 60%. And for planned colonies, that is the residents who are coming from planned colonies in the survey, this modal value is at about 90%, which reveals the state, or specifically the government's failure even to provide safe drinking water in the planned areas of the city. To gain access to basic services, residents in excluded settlements of the city, that is Jhuggi-Jhopri clusters, unauthorized colonies, and resettlement colonies, are also involved in negotiated political arrangements. These range from unbalanced relations, which are ad hoc, temporary, involving multiple actors and multiple political intermediaries, to others that are much more stable and organized, involving a few political intermediaries. Moreover, self-organization of residents is routinely dependent on elected representatives, as well as the political alignments of those representatives. And negotiations that residents in excluded settlements engage in, whether it's with regard to water and sanitation services, or whether it's with regard to tenure and everyday construction activities, vary not only within a particular settlement type, but also across settlement types. So they of course vary across settlement types, but they also vary within a settlement types, and some within a settlement type, and sometimes even within the same settlement. So it could be that the kind of negotiations a set of residents have to undertake for everyday water supply in one part of a settlement are quite distinct from those that are undertaken by residents who are geographically located in a different part of the same settlement. So how likely is it that this differentiated and negotiated citizenship in Delhi will reduce in the years to come? It is often claimed that the intersection of governments in Delhi makes policy change difficult. And this is particularly so in recent years because the Aam Aadmi Party, which is governing Delhi at the state government level, is constantly at sort of loggerheads with the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is sitting at the Union Government of India, but also at the level of local government here, that is at the MCD level. But still, what we see is that there tends to be a kind of alignment in the way they promise services as well as tenure to residents and voters, specifically of informal settlements in Delhi. So changes have been promised to unauthorized colony residents in the form of regularization or a new process of regularization. And this has not been limited to just a promise. It has been followed up with concrete action in which applications for regularization have been processed. And during election time, another promise that we have heard across party lines has been one of Jahan Jhuggi Wahan Makan, which is a promise of in situ upgradation or in situ rehabilitation, that is rehabilitation of Jhuggi Jhopri cluster residents at the same site. Again, we see both the Aam Aadmi Party as well as the BJP making very similar promises on this to voters in JJC clusters, and this reveals that there might be more congruence in policy across levels of government than we tend to imagine. However, finally, changes in policy are not quite enough, and changes in practices, which is what everyday interactions that residents have to go through to access, for instance, water and sanitation, are also needed. And what we know is that the existing legislation actually allows for basic services to be extended to most of these areas, and so they're not as restrictive as we are often told. But at the same time, the ground reality is that most of these residents are still paying high premiums to be able to access some of these services. So I'll end there, and Shamindra will now tell us about spatial inequality across the NCT.
Thank you, Shahana. Just as we get Shomindra's presentation up, tell you that he's an associate fellow here at CPR, but he's a geographer by training, and he's worked with, I think, administrative data and urban data much more than I think anyone else I know in India. So it's a real treat to have him talk about what he was able to put together for us. I mean, one of the things that I am very proud of in this book is some of the work that Shamindra and Shahana were a part of, which is taking a different project, which was qualitative and administrative in nature, Cities of Delhi, and figuring out how to merge it, basically keep it as a living work, merge it with survey data that was collected many years later to be able to come up with implications. So let me just quickly share the screen. And
thanks, Neelan. As Neelan told, that my entry point to this book is after the survey. A large part of my chapter that I worked with came as a reframing the survey to the larger literature and the larger project that Shahana and the team has, Dr. Parson and the teams have worked on Cities of Delhi. And though my entry point is spatial inequality, I'm not going to waste much time of that. We have talked enough on it. But to just sum up with that, why spatial inequality is important, and here I focus on infrastructure, but of course, as you see in Neelan's presentation as well, there are much more dimensions to exploit it. The reason spatial inequality is important in an urban setup is that our cities are in a continuous flux. And when we talk about flux, I don't mean at the individual level, but also at the spatial level, like your neighborhood, the environment, the temporal processes through which you create that environment to that space. So I tell it is a history of settling, and it matters. And it matters because different responses to the governance processes and people's negotiation continuously co-produce and morph that over time. And that morphing essentially leads to new forms of spatial inequality. So through that, this presentation, I'll mostly talk about some of those different layers of spatial informality that we get through a co-production of city space and reproduction of city space, and the way, one of the very possible ways we can approach to these problems using this unique survey data. So far we have seen, Shahana already talked about that really complex table of like 8 categories, and it's a complex spatial terrain. And the reason it is complex, it has to very specific line of research like anything. Quantitatively, if we approach, we can look at different government data points, census, National Sample Survey of India, and there are works of people at various levels. Using census, people have done ward level inequality assessment of services in Delhi, urban local bodies. So Delhi, again, if we like think Delhi as a category, we will never end up anywhere. Like we can start at wards, we can start up enumeration block, we can start at different cities and villages within Delhi. So there are quantitative work that has basically looked at these different dimensions, but there are limitations to that. And of course, there are qualitative studies that are very in-depth. The limitations of the macro quantitative work is of twofold. Number one is the question of scale. As a student of geography, we always are getting fascinated by how scale matters actually. The way we look at the way segregation, inequality, these parameters form is very different across spatial scales. The way people need to distribute themselves may not always form the natural occurring boundaries, closely defined administrative boundaries. And there are enough work on Neelan's own stuff that he showed and work on to talk about that. And coming to the ward level, which is almost 60 to 65,000 people at the current administrative jurisdiction in Delhi, even at an enumeration block, which is much granular than ward level, it's 500, more than 500 people in Delhi, is not enough to understand how those changes form at a local spatial scale. So in this case, the geolocated, the other way to approach it through in-depth studies, which Cities of Delhi has done and various other studies have done. Some of I have mentioned here. But what is a good approach to look at it in a more synchronized way? I think here my intervention comes into this book to using the Kasi-NCR data to make it in that fashion. I had two very basic questions that the differentiation that the literature usually tells how it comes when we use neighborhood level survey data, which has geocoded point data sets in it, and how spatial inequality unfolds across and within settlements, not only across these categories, but even we superimpose other forms of reproduction in the categories, and how much you can answer that using these particular cases of data. And then I had another secondary questions that if you look at the social lines of differences, how this microspatial inequality that I'm going to ask in this chapter looks in relation to that. I focused for this particular example on the NCT data set of Kasi-NCR survey, which has roughly 349 households, and where we have 300 unique polling booths. And the process I would do it is basically postcoding. So these settlements that Shahana showed, they were not part of the initial sampling frame of the survey. So after the survey data came in, we basically this diagram tries to what it did basically was I go into this polling booths, and for each polling booth we have the description of the polling booth in the electoral roll that comes with. It gives a name of the particular type of locality that polling booth is situated or it serves. Then I went back to a database which basically gives the typification of these polling booths in terms of these 8 categories that Shahana told, and also the property category list. So these are my two main axes to look at spatial inequality in Delhi. And I matched this, and then I matched it to the colony typification, and I geolocated them, because we, in the Kasi survey, we had, for each polling booth, we had a geolocation, but here multiple polling booths may serve one particular locality. So where I took the midpoint of those colonies as the representative geolocation, and I newly geolocated them. So it basically went through a lot of process of post-processing. Now, while I do that, there are, so in this way, it's sort of an experiment to see that something that is very structural to Delhi that Shahana showed, and any cities of India, when you superimpose it at a later scale, how does it look like? That was the challenge at the end of this whole chapter, and how good it comes in this case. And the other point was also that as we look at this, how much diversity we can pick, because since this thing was not part of the earlier sampling frame, there was possibility that we may end up picking up one particular sort of informal colony and not others. But as I did the post coding, two main things come out. The first thing is this thing was pretty structured, because even if the initial survey did not looked at it, we have been able to find out quite a good number of each proportion of colonies. If we go back to Shahana's asset index graph, where she shows that we have 3 different type of colonies in three different location of asset index. One is where riches reside, the planned colonies, where the poor people reside, where the JJC is one, which is, and the middle one is RUCs. In all these cases, we find a good representation as the numbers here with the original table that Delhi government has given us. So even if we strategically did not sample it, it came up really nicely in the data. And this next big point that we got here is that this is pretty mixed structure. So we got our 60% of polling booths are more than 1 colonies, and we get maximum 3 different kinds of colonies in a PV, in a 1 polling booth. And these mixed colonies are not only because that we find multiple types of colonies in a polling booth, but also these known categories that Shahana showed, they also got morphed over time. So one particular colony is resettlement colony, which has been done like 40 years ago from now. This does not look like a resettlement colony. Then we had a dilemma to where to put it. And we put them as mixed colony because we didn't know where this thing. So this is another way we see that if we really want to categorize the city, and I'll go back to Professor Srivastava's presentation in the morning, that what satellite data, etc., try to do is, at the end of the day, the goal is to categorization. It becomes very hard if you start from a very data standpoint perspective. This is again some portrayal of the mixed speciality of the city. The right hand side, what basically satellite captured Delhi over time, the built up growth of the city over different waves of master plan. The main key point that comes out from the table at the right, from the map at the right hand side, is that the city has grown differently at different periods of time. If you look at the eastern periphery of the city, it has already been grown a lot by the early 1990s. And the kind of reproduction of space that we are talking about, ideally I would expect more in that space rather than a space where it's currently growing, which is the southwestern part of the yellow part of the city. I took this map as my early reference point to look into those different spatial clusters to see that how the diversity of colonies look like. And what I see here is that the eastern periphery, for example, I see that it has a very high diversity of colonies, so as the western periphery. The southern periphery, on the other hand, which is the more elite part of the city, I don't find, I find more of a unique sort of colonies that are coming up. So city has mixed speciality, it links with the nature of city growth, but at the same time, there are intra-city variations in terms of that speciality. Coming to the question of service inequalities, I told that I looked at different ways we can quantify. So the bottom line of this, that we find a multi-layered pattern of spatial inequality when you look at services. The first layer is, for example, segregation despite co-location, which Neelan also showed, but in terms of services points out. The left graph here basically shows the three different kinds of colonies that Shahana showed in her earlier graph, but here I plotted the build or formal water connection in the colony. So as we can see that the economic perspective of it very clearly shows up in any of these spaces. If you look at the, so legality is the first term of layering when we talk about inequality in spatial infrastructure in the city. And that legality has also spatial connotations. In the right hand side, I plotted the approach to share of households with motorable pakka approach. So the redder it is, the more red it is, the more higher households have access to motorable pakka road. What we find is that the yellow and reds, they just coterminous to each other. Like what Neelan also showed, that you have very different sort of assets, but when you look at trunk services, that pattern also get replicated. Now, when Shahana talked about a lot of this is self-invested, a lot of this is where state does not really invest. And when we look at that, that basically contributes to this discontinuity over time. If we go back to the data and we see, we can, so segregation in terms of very close proximities is the first layer of spatial inequality. The second layer is the core periphery differentials. We have seen that there are substantial differences across the core and the periphery in terms of in public investment infrastructure. Pipes here we take because it's one of the service where the state actually provides a lot of money. It's a network service, and we see they are essentially concentrated at the center of Delhi. What the implication of this is, it creates differences within the categories. So in the right hand side, I have plotted JJ clusters and resettlement colonies. The resettlement colonies in the eyes of the states are just planned slums. They are the JGCs, but planned, but they are put in the periphery of the city. But at the same time, you have a planned imagination of the city, or planned imagination of the informal in the city. But at the same time, you have spatial the spatial allocation of resources are very different across codes and peripheries, which basically leads to this weird sort of differences where we get the more informal has actually ended up having a higher level of underground drainage than the more planned slum in the city. So this is other layer of spatial inequality that comes into when we look at this thing. Similar thing we say in some case of urban villages, which are the core of the city, and rural villages, the periphery of the city. The third layer is when we look at spatial inequality cross-calculated with other axes of inequality. Here I took two. One is the time variable, another is the property category variable that I did. When you look temporality as a factor, and temporality is important because it's again linked to the co-production and the reproduction of the city space. We see that older resettlement, regularized unauthorized colonies, which is the dashed line, have a bimodal distribution of this thing, the access to treated drinking water. And the newer resettlement colonies have a better, in that sense, distribution of this thing. And there the question of the private investment comes into the place, that within a same category, if you go into two very different kinds of colonies, new resettlement colonies which comes up in the periphery, the state investment is lower, where a lot of private investment comes in, and you get a higher sort of people investing in treatment facilities in water. So time comes as a very important axis. And now if we dive deep to the questions of property categories, Delhi has this property category where they divide the city into multiple kinds, depends on the taxation areas, and the higher it is, so D&E is more prosperous than the others. We see that in all cases, there are significant spatial differentiation even within a particular case of regularized unauthorized colony, if we divide them by other kinds of records. So the bottom line of all these things is that the question of spatial inequality does not end in the question of space itself. It gets reproduced if you put more variables into it. My final question is the spatial and social divisions of infrastructure. Basically, this is a small exercise to see that the observed social differentiation in infrastructure in the city, do you see it more or less than the observed spatial differentiation infrastructure? The left-hand side picks up the social categories from the Kasi survey, And I plotted two things: houses with basic amenities, and basic amenities is a combination of three different kinds of facilities. We have the household which have a pakka house, household we have a fully constructed toilet, and a household which have a formal or built water connection. The difference between the maximum and the minimum here, as we see, is much larger in comparison if we look at the spatial differentiation in the city. And so there are certainly differences in the social lines, but the first point is it's not as larger as we look at the spatial lines. And if even if we take the colonies where the social profile is very similar, we see wide differences in terms of availability of services. So from a very 30,000 feet perspective, I don't get any overarching this thing that the social identity being taken as a more stronger axis of inequality in comparison to spatial when public services of distribution is concerned. I tried to do this with multivariate analysis, which I have not put it here. So concluding remarks is this, that we find even if it's a post-coding exercise and the intervention comes much later to a survey, the thing is structural, and we find it broadly corroborates with what Shahana and the post-coding literature has told. Legality is a major determinant that has been so far talked in the survey, but the arguments, as we saw, does not end here. It goes beyond the legal categories. And this geocoded information, there at the one hand very extremely useful to decode this legality, and we see mapping is a part of enumeration very much these days. But how do we use it is a question. And what beyond basic services? I think last point that Shahana told, that over time the state choose to invest irrespective of legality in the various kinds of spaces. So if we extend that questions to the question of employment, food security, because at the end of the day, these spatial inequalities are very much linked to the place-based entitlements to the city. So if we talk about unmet demand for food, if we talk about peripheralization and it's linked to job loss in the city, how does they look like? These are some of the possible questions that can be explored. Khusdeep will talk on migration after this, and hope that.
So our final presentation this panel is from Khusdeep or Malhotra, and you will see the strong influence of this framework of spatial inequality as we look to make sense of some of the more complicated things that are happening in and. Khusdeep Malhotra is an adjunct instructor at Temple University. She is also a geographer and works across qualitative and quantitative methods, and you'll see some of that specialization in the discussion today.
So really, I'm a qualitative person. Quant is not my area of comfort. I should clarify that. And I had a lot of help from Neelanjan, Shamindra, and Kanu while writing this chapter or doing the statistical analysis for it. So with that disclaimer, I look specifically at the migration module of the CASI NCR survey. And I want to say that many of the things that you'll hear about in this chapter are well documented. So in a sense, the contribution that this chapter was making was that it was confirming that those things are still persistent even after people have migrated to the city. So the purpose of this paper was to understand the implications of urbanization for migrants, or how the two intersected, since we're assuming that urbanization does blunt some of the effects of social and spatial inequality for people who have moved to the city for a better life. And so therefore, we should see very little or no differences between migrants and non-migrants. So to begin with, we definitely grappled with how to categorize migrants, since NCR has changed very much over the course of time, and people who moved much earlier to the city, historical migration essentially is different than the other types of migration that the city has experienced. So it was difficult to categorize people as migrants or non-migrants, sort of based on when they moved into the city. And there is no temporality as to like when somebody moved into the city. That question wasn't asked. So we used the following criteria, which is the criteria that's used in other surveys. Is if you were enumerated in a district that's different than your birth district, then you were a migrant. And in addition to this, if you gave a reason for moving to NCR, you said, yes, I moved for marriage or whatever, but you may not have given a year during which you moved to NCR, or you simply gave a year, but not any reason, or said that you were from somewhere else, you were categorized as a migrant. And then on the household level also, the categorization was based on whether the head of the household reported that they were a migrant, or even whether any member of the household was a migrant. So based on this categorization, 26.6% of the survey was categorized as migrants, and 20% of the households were categorized as migrant households. And just for comparison, in the census in 2011, 37% of the households were categorized as migrants across India, and in NSS 28.5%. Some of the main findings in the CASI NCR survey, the share of people migrating is young and largely female. So that is the sort of main takeaway from this graph. These are sort of the general demographic characteristics of migrants. The thing that we found interesting was that migration is a very strikingly gendered phenomenon, and migrants are overwhelmingly female, as you can see from this graph. And even among female migrants, 80% of the migrants moved for marriage, and only around 8% moved for a household member's employment, and the rest moved for work or to go to school. And male migration was still predominantly related to employment. So about 65% of the males said that they moved for work. This graph sort of breaks it down by year, and we see some interesting trends here that after 2010, a greater share of females who reported not moving for marriage, so that they moved for reasons other than marriage, such as employment or education or escaping an adverse situation, of which there was a small group, still predominantly were not, So first thing is that this share was greater than males, and even among the women that reported not moving for marriage, but for other reasons, more than 70% was still reporting attending to domestic duties only, okay, compared to non-migrant women. And 21% are unemployed or are seeking work. So that means they're still in the labor force, but they are unemployed. So that was the first main sort of striking finding. And this is different than what the literature has found earlier. So Ravinder Kaur's work has said that, a marriage migration isn't necessarily a negative for women who are moving, because, and it is even a positive. They don't necessarily drop out of the workforce and they're able to work. But our survey was finding that this wasn't the case. And then the second thing that I want to highlight here is at the household level, what we are finding is that 20% of the households reported having a head of household who migrated to NCR. UP and Bihar remain sort of the top sending states, and Haryana, Punjab, Rajasthan are the other states along with them who continue to send migrants to the city. You can see from these maps that, so the left map is of migrants and the right one is of non-migrants, that migrants are more spread out. That means they're further away from the core of the city. And as it has been discussed much in several of the presentations here, what this means is that there is a certain spatial disadvantage, which I'll show in a second, but it also translates to a social disadvantage being further away from the core of the city. So these are the household characteristics of migrant households. We can see that the share of SC/ST migrants still is lesser than general or OBC category migrants. And the interesting findings were that, even though the asset index that Neelanjan calculated there doesn't seem to be a big difference between migrant and non-migrant households. If you look at that, when you sort of bring caste into the equation, then what happens is that, the first thing is that migrants still have poorer access to infrastructure, such as, having poorer access to pakka roads and pakka drainage. But if you add caste to the equation, then the problem becomes worse. So lower caste migrants are more likely to have worse access to infrastructure, and they also have a spatial disadvantage in terms of where they live in the city. So from this short data analysis, one can say that it's unclear whether urbanization is having the intended effect of reducing inequalities for migrants. And the two main findings are that there are persistent gender inequalities. That is, even for women who are moving for employment, the bulk of them are reporting doing only domestic duties and are not in the workforce actively, and that there is a persistent social and spatial disadvantage that carries over, in terms of migrants who are more far away from the core of the city and who have poorer access to infrastructure. And of course, caste is exaggerating these differences. And these findings have been corroborated by the work of others like Surinder Jutka and Ved, who argue that really, rather than disappearing, inequalities become horizontal and they continue to persist in terms of caste when people move to the city. And that's all I have.
So I'll let people gather their thoughts for a second as for question answer. So we have 4:47, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I just want to say one thing before we open the Q&A, that in some sense our last two speakers have been humble in not telling you how hard it is to make some of those figures and graphs. So just to give you some sense of what the mathematical challenge here is, usually when you see surfaces that are put on dashboards, it's made from census data. This is made from survey data. So there are certain kinds of surfaces that make sense, and there's certain kinds of surfaces that don't make sense. And so you have to work hard with the data to be able to get the kinds of graphs that they were able to get out there in these presentations. You can see how meaningful it is for our ability to understand what's happening in the region. Okay, so I want to just throw it up for any questions that you might have. Vinay?
Yeah, a couple of questions for Shahana and Shamindra and one for Khusdeep. So I was just wondering whether there's a way in which you can link service provision and tenure stability to the election cycle. So just before an election, politicians come and somebody living in a juggy jhoppi had a 1-point agenda, electricity, right? Because anecdotally, I'd done some research on this way back when I was a lawyer in Bangalore, and I could map this one particular slum, Baile Kaval. Each facility is just before an election. So I was just wondering. And so that's for both of you. And Shahana, one of your co-authors, Patrick Heller, I remember attending a talk by him and he showed appetite of Delhi, right? Way back in 2012. So obviously your data is, so you have data from pre-2012 from one of your co-authors, and then you have your data. And have you seen a change in terms of services? Has technology between those two data sets shown that, there's just more of the state now makes these parts visible, right? Because you have access to these two data sets, right? And Khushi, I just found quite fascinating the idea, which I had no idea, but many of you do, that disproportionately it's upper caste, then OBCs, and then SCs who migrate. And my kind of anecdotal thought was that migration is an act of desperation. But this seems to show otherwise, that there needs to be some level of capital and networks that pre-exist migration to begin with. And therefore people with advantage migrate. Right? So I was just wondering.
I can talk on the, and then I can talk on the linking stuff. It's possible to look at this. This is just one layer of matching. The one way to look at is to, since it's a little easier to do in this case because we have the polling booth as our main linking factor, which links it back to the colony category data. and the Kasi NCR survey data where you had the socioeconomic attributes. The other part that you are talking about, the election data, which is also organized. So the survey date, I think 2015 is the nearest election. It's possible to pick up the polling booths and link it back to the Form 20 data to that particular year, and one can do a larger. That's another round of getting external data set into the survey, and that's interesting. Given like the various ways we can actually use this survey for larger opportunities. So that is, but over time, because we talk about cycles as well. I mean, by cycles, I think that it's both ways, like over time and across different hierarchies of elections. It's also possible, like Shahana and I and some one of our other colleagues, we actually tried to do some of this stuff. It needs a lot of iterations to match back and forth because polling stations change. The area they cover that changes. So one needs to take care of those spatial adjustments. But I think principally it's very much doable to link it to the elections. Now,
yeah, I mean, I think I'll just follow up on 2 points and then respond to the specific question later. So, I mean, I think quantitatively that can be in principle done, which is that you look at election times and look at activities or service provision just before and just after. But we also know qualitatively, at least on these 10 settlements where, incidentally our election field, our fieldwork overlapped with 2 state elections, 2013, 2015, as well as a national election in 2014. And we could see on the ground, just before the model code of conduct would be implemented, there would be a kind of hurried set of service provision kind of activities that would happen. This could be in the form of Pakka roads being redone, even if they didn't need to be done again, or water, especially tanker truck, the water tanker timing, the regularity, predictability of their arrival time and how much water people could get. Those things certainly we saw on the ground just before election, some of that. So there is, we do have some qualitative observations on this, which could probably complement where some of the quantitative data may be a little hard to,
yes.
Yeah, in addition, even drainage cleaning services, for instance, somehow around that election time, you would have those workers turning up at regularly to clean the stormwater drains and things like that. And of course, the tenure related point, electoral promises were made in actually all those 3 elections related to tenure security, especially for resettlement colonies to some extent. The moving from sort of the leasehold to freehold, that was one of the promises, but also for unauthorized colonies, the regularization. And while we saw less of actual policy change at that time, we over time see, for instance, this PM Uday scheme, which has been instituted, which did happen eventually, although regularization as a process has been promised time and again, even previously. So that was some response to that. In the second question that you asked about what, over time, sort of pre-2012, post-2012, and I do want to emphasize that our fieldwork for this project, the Cities of Delhi project, concludes in 2015. Yes, we did see, we do have, again, qualitative data from field observations, which allows us to make certain comparisons. So one example, again, I go back to water because it is one of the most contested and negotiated services that we found in the field. In one of our field sites, which is Sangam Vihar, which several of you would be aware of, which is supposed to be the largest unauthorized colony in all of Asia. What we refer to it as a sort of agglomeration of unauthorized colonies, because there's several in there. One of the changes that did happen on the ground was actually regularization of water connections, of sort of what had become sort of this private network of water provisioning to every household, was brought under public control a little after it's again related to the election timing that we were just talking about. But that was like, for instance, one of the service improvements in terms of the kinds of premium and stuff that residents have to pay, which came down. But soon after, when the next election was coming around, it again went up. So, these things are obviously in flux, and given that they're negotiated, sometimes the premiums are low, sometimes the premiums are higher for residents. But yeah, we do have, in addition to water, we have some additional qualitative observations again across time with regard to sewerage infrastructure and sanitation, specifically community toilet complexes, their functioning, and drainage and cleaning. So we can bring that in. We brought that in a little bit, I think, in the chapter, but maybe I couldn't bring it in as much in the presentation.
And Khushi?
So I think your question has answered itself. SC/ST migrants are, according to this data, moving less, and perhaps that is a network effect. But from the survey, it's hard to say whether that is indeed what is happening.
I mean, one data point that came actually this morning in HD is that most people moving to cities are moving from other cities, right? That is one of these sort of interesting data points, right? We think of village to city migration, but in fact, patterns are quite a bit more complicated. Just one other small thing before I open a question, I would say is that, one of the things that we don't know, and I've asked actually people who work on this stuff a lot on migration and so on and so forth, we're very bad at understanding selection effects on migration. So in other words, when we are collecting data on a migrant, we're collecting data on somebody who survived, right? Anytime you do fieldwork in a village, every human being, every male in particular under the age of 40 or 45 has tried to live in the city, right? Most have failed.
So that might explain.
So we don't know, right? I mean, these are things we don't. And I think what is frightening about this prospect is that on one level, the incentive of apex cities is to make them very tough, so that only the people who are more privileged and who have means are the only ones who can survive, right? So these are things that we don't know, right? I mean, we know that the politics of making a city more livable is actually a lot more complicated than we might first think when you start thinking about selection effects. From the question, there's a question.
Just to add that, during COVID, that was very visible in how we think about health services.
Yeah, exactly. So there's it's something that we should encourage. Sanjay, you sorry?
I wanted to say it's a qualitative process. So in the survey that was in 2019, which is about Institute and giving and I'm just trying to think about how one makes sense of survey mechanism and technology. In 2019, there was a survey that was carried out by Lucid. Firstly, the problem was that it was done across Lucid land and Neelanjan. That was the three then none of the training, 200 of them, had any training at all. They were given these apps which fill information, which eventually ended up that there were three different criteria that we used to map. One was chulhas, how many chulhas. Sometimes it was how many independent doors we have chulhas, and thirdly electricity. So depending on what the situation of the household was, each obviously was distributed 10 years, so they gave whatever. And so the information that we had is so completely bizarre. It has so many different points of reference that it's impossible to say what it actually means. So, sometimes it was that if you have three independent doors in the house, there are three different families. You could say three. Sometimes people say, no, they're chulas. They are Hindus and they are separate chulas. Their sons have got that. So completely dependent on social life of the house. I wonder how that makes sense. Just quickly, the dispensation should be very interesting. And I wonder how, again, one makes sense because in Gurgaon, for example, there's a national land reform modernization project that's happening. And the satellite technology that's used, so it's happening right now, is that ultimately what the georeferencing is really problematic. Ultimately, what you depend on is the memory of the old data. So what happens in the very villages in Gurgaon is that because of caste, spaceship configurations, villagers will say, look, every inch is worth a land. People say, no, this land is completely true. and the Wasabi for the Srivastava map. These are the methods of the labs. Ultimately, what the GIS specialists do with us at Haryana Special is that they completely rely on the so-called most respected elderly men in the village. So I wonder how does one incorporate these things without being technophobic. Think about that. How does one, what do one do?
Yes, I think, sir, the one issue is there is the question of scale, because when agencies do this at a massive level, they had to resort to some sort of this data collection. But I don't know, you can educate me that how much ground truthing been done after, because one of the basic principle of remote sensing is ground truthing, like the basic way this thing, like what you capture from space, you see that and you analyze, because at the end of the day, what's happening is I'm sending you a bunch of electromagnetic radiation, and my sensor capturing those signals, various terms, and I'm classifying them. This is road, this is vegetation, to be very broad categories. This is river, etc. Now this whole process has been run through a complex set of predefined algorithms. There are scope of people getting into it and correct it, which we tell as supervised learning to very. But a part of the supervised learning is to get into the ground truthing exercise. Like even if it automatically detects someone as a boundary of some colony, is it the boundary or is it the boundary of the natural monument that's not supposed to be in the colony or outside? So I don't know, sir, that how much of this ground truthing being done before classifying these maps into actually categories. And I think all these spatial exercises leads us to this very fundamental question that as we want to at least spatially categorize the city, where do we finish and how do we give it a shape? This whole exercise give it a shape. This is a very integral part, and my sense is that we don't do that enough, and we landed up to this thing. Our over reliance, and there the question of that how this governance is structured that you told also comes in, because we are looking at this process of categorizing and mapping the city from a very top-down perspective. We have technocrats sitting and mapping, but we also need a parallel base at the ground which need to supplement this, which the current workforce that is employed, I don't think that's there. And that education, how do you, I mean, at one hand you are going technocratic, but the kind of people who do this, I mean, even translate that old person's thing to version to the algorithm, that chain of communication is not there. Who will do that, and how it will be completed? Challenge to the state itself, because we are acclimatized to very one sense of bureaucracy when it comes to mapping. Like cadastral maps we used to do by hand, and then we shifted to, there's a sort of leapfrogging in the whole situation.
I mean, the only two finger I'd put on that is that, you know, in some sense, the state of the art is introducing more problems. And so nowadays people, governments, whether it be welfare programs, whether it be these kinds of access, are getting into grievance procedures, right? And grievance procedures have a problem in that typically what's going on in the grievance procedures is the grievance is going straight to the top. It's cutting out the middleman, so to speak, explicitly. And of course, settling a grievance procedure is also explicitly political. So one way to sort of think about this, you know, as a big data, you know, I work with a lot of big data, right? It's like, we're going to go do something. It'll have mistakes. People can raise grievances, and in principle, based on those grievances, we can get the right answer or as close to approximation. In practice, settling a grievance is very hard if you are sitting at the top and you have no information about what's happening at the bottom, right? And unless you have a grievance procedure that is very explicitly tied to either the old man in the village or something else, it's not clear what the resolution is. Your road can go missing in the case of your example.
Can I have a different response to you?
Yeah.
See, my own sense is, and Sanjay knows this very well. There's been terrific literature, say, on census and how census is put together. But it requires that one gives up the language of mistakes. If a census person comes and says, look, I did my census well, my data is robust, that's not how you engage with the census and the categories of the census. My census survey data, I've been reluctant to take that leap. So typically, if you have a critique survey, it ends up, no, my data is robust, my data is correct. I've been, if there are faults, I can rectify it. I don't think you'll get a critique of how data assembly is done unless you're willing to accept that the categories through which we work are open to negotiation, open to free thinking. So I don't think the mistake part will, that part will take you to a good understanding of how data sets are served, especially survey data. And now in Delhi, given that we have had surveys since when? The big one was 57, 58, this Greater Delhi survey. I'm sure there's tons of data to look through how our categories have formed.
Okay. Arkaja, then Sanjoy. I know that. I know.
I'd like to add to this.
Okay.
So this is covered. But I think there's an underlying presumption that there is a truth that is one. And I think most of us would dispute that idea itself. So what we have is approaches to getting information. It's a sociological approach to getting information. There's an anthropological approach to getting information. And the two may not actually converge and give you the same output. But as long as we accept that there is no single normal truth, I'm okay with it, and most of us should. That's my view.
Arkaja, yes.
To take Sanjoy's kind of phrasing of this a bit further, I'd like to make this point that there is possibly two truths that we're talking about when we're talking about land survey data and human survey data. And I think it's important to think of those two things. Thank you. So, I just wanted to make the point that there are possibly two truths that we're talking about when we talk about land survey data or land mapping data and human survey data. One, with human survey data, there's no intermediary between server and the surveyor and the person and the respondent. Whereas with land survey data, there is a bureaucracy of the Patwari and the land review administration. So there is, it is tied into a administrative process. And the other aspect of it is that it's not grievances that arise out of faulty land survey data, but like legal dispute, because it, very specifically determines people and, coming from a like sort of rural background, I, feel the kind of importance of those. And, I hear a lot of this in Bihar, where I come from, where, about this land mapping and the kind of technical limitations of the technological limitations of the land mapping process is how it determines boundaries and, faultily determines boundaries. So I just wanted to point to the fact that we're talking about like two different kinds of technology and two different kinds of like technology and state interactions.
I think that's absolutely right. I can see through the stuff. Also, by the way, Bihar has really animated our discussion today in Delhi. I can say. Okay, so here's what I'd say. I think we have a lot of questions. So technically, we're done. We can go. Anyone who wants to, feel free. But so I can see that there are 3-4 questions out there. You've been raising your hand for a long time, and I'll just work across the room this way.
I was looking at the PM this scheme actually. There are a lot of GIS being done actually. Then they give there is a lot of dispute also regarding the GIS numbers actually. And so they go and check out with the customer number. What is the number of their houses actually? And that is also a problem where many of them have the same number. Same number is leading to a problem where they say that your number is not matching with the other number. Maybe it's also in the GIS map, it shows the house is here, but your number is there somewhere outside the areas. So these kind of problems are arising regarding the GIS, and they don't know where to go actually. So then they go with the help desk. There are lot more intermediaries who are playing a role where all your documents are to be made. With regard to the field list.
So the one, I think the one random thing that you've touched on too is we had to deal with how messy GPS data actually is. It's very hard to get accurate readings, and often you don't get readings from any observations. Push here and then here.
Yeah, just tiny point to add to that. There's like multiple temporalities at play. None of this is happening in real time, and none of this is happening in sequence. Like grievances, court cases, purchase of land, which triggers a question about the land's ownership and how it belongs in which map, and which top official looks at a map at which stage, is all happening in different temporalities. So just like that's another thing that I gets added to information. One thing I want to go back to was the map at the end of your presentation to speak about like the spatial inequality of migrants. That map which sort of said, well, you know, in terms of inequality, they are sort of left out of the core of the city. And just again, want to point out there is no core of the city. There is no city, first of all. It's like this massive thing that extends from Bihar all the way up to Rajasthan.
It feels like that.
So for many of these people, again, I'm a bit and like speaking to a lot of people, it actually makes sense to come from east and like go to the closest eastern suburban fringe area, get a job, be successful and go back seasonally. So maybe for a lot of these people, it's not actually the objective to come to the core of the city. So just
And I neglected to mention that that is something that the survey is not looking at. It's just sort of looking at migration.
I would like to add what Khushi said. I think it's not technically the core. It's like if you see the distribution of migrants, like JJ clusters in Delhi, which houses the most vulnerable migrant population in Delhi, are all at the core of the city. Like at the core of the city. So, I mean, at the center of the city, let's say, I understand your larger point that city boundary is fluid, and I think the point that you wanted to make is that if you look at the process of peripheralization, etc., how that unfolds from that, like low-income migrants, for them, of course, these things are not being looked at in relation to the correlation between residence and workplace. So if you map the workplace, if your location is at the periphery, as you can say, then it is fine. But at the core, so these are all relative to what how we see core and periphery, not like literal core or literal periphery in that sense.
So you had a question.
I just was curious. You have a very objective definition of migration, and the more I hear the conversation goes more and more towards the low income group, but that's not the way you sort of presented any of your data. I mean, actually talking more than you. So I just wanted, and then this conclusion that 2010 onwards, migration is actually lower than from popular history. 2010 is when Commonwealth happens, and the whole infrastructure development of Delhi happens from early 2000s onwards, where we see this whole influx which led to COVID and the idea that they don't want to die in the city. So how do you reconcile all this data that you're capturing, and then you have a popular history which is actually showing popular history, I would say, and a lived history. We live in Delhi, which is showing exactly the opposite of what you're saying.
I mean, I'll let you go. Go ahead.
So I think maybe what is happening is that the boundaries of NCR are expanding, and that's what the data are capturing in terms of where people are migrating to. I don't know that I have a better answer than that.
So, I mean, there was a lot of work put in by Khusdeep and others trying to figure out how we would characterize migrants in the state. And part of the challenge that you're facing is that Delhi is a city of migrants. I mean, actually, in almost every definition you use, you just have ridiculously high percentage of the population, rich, poor, middle, being classified as migrants. So I think some of it may be an artifact of that. I think one of the things that I did see in the data, which was surprising, is that, you know, even people that we are, let's say, characterizing as Purvanchali, Bihari, so on and so forth, no, the kids are being born in Delhi, right? So they are not being considered migrants, right? And yet our popular imagination of who is a Purvanchali. So what's weird is these categories are actually bigger than the mechanics of who has moved to the region, right? So I think the Purvanchali, for instance, has a very large part of our imagination of what a migrant might mean in Delhi. It's not obvious. I actually don't know if I have any studies of this, of people trying to match what we imagine a Bhuvanjali to be to these formal definitions of migration.
But have you done studies which deal with sort of migrancies of labor for the development of Delhi as a have you done any research?
We can-
CPR has, but
Not specifically in Delhi, but we can have this discussion.
so there is definitely an.
I don't also know that migration has reduced in Delhi post 2010.
One thing I'd like to chat that's come up in this, since we are
Yeah, we're done, basically. We're
sort of
just
talking about methodology. The survey method in India, in Delhi certainly, excludes all of us. Because it is virtually impossible for a surveyor to enter a planned colony, get inside a house and ask questions. So whereas our information bubbles, our individual information bubbles are full of characters like ourselves.
Absolutely.
So we basically create stories about people like ourselves who are missing from our data. The larger point being, once again, the different methods from anthropological to sociological to extraterrestrial tell you somewhat different stories. The old metaphor, trying to describe an elephant, it's we can't get to a singular thing because there is no possibly singular. But we must recognize that every survey in India, including those done by the government, is missing the top 5% of the population all the time because nobody can get inside the house.
Excellent.
Okay, I think that is actually a good place to end the substantive material. I'm gonna actually ask Tarek Tachal, who is here in the room,
and had indicated the time he would come, but that was
as the director of TASI, to just close our panel.
Yeah, well, thanks. This is I think the third discussion of Colossus that I've attended in the past year. And what's really amazing about the book, I think, is that each of the discussions has been completely different. And I have like lists of questions at the end of each one that are new and that are interesting. And that I think speaks to the richness of the enterprise. And it's really difficult to have something that's as varied as this, that still has some kind of cohesive thread through it. And I think it's a credit to all the authors as well as, of course, the editors that they were able to do that. And I think, it's been a labor of love. It was part of Cassie's 25th anniversary workshop. This year, coming up, starting July 1st, is Cassie's 30th anniversary. So that goes to show you that good work takes time and takes a lot of effort. And it's only, I think there are a lot of questions that this provokes, and in many ways kind of makes the point that Neelan, that you started with about thinking at metropolitan scale. A lot of the discussion is focused on the empirics of that in this panel, but there's also a lot of conceptual fodder for not just the study of India, but really the urban studies about what can be learned from studying metropolitan scale for cities of other sizes, for urban studies outside of India. And I think this book has a lot to offer in those regards. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, but also especially to all the contributors. It's so nice to be able to see a panel full of them here and a whole days of activities full of them. And so just join me in thanking everybody for coming, and to the contributors for this book, which look forward to reading again and again.